Welcome to Across the Pitch. Let's get into it. Today we will cover the Arsenal City game, the United game, and the Barcelona game. Starting with Arsenal. Listen, we need to talk about what we just witnessed today because Arsenal didn't just beat Manchester City, they bullied them. I'm struggling to find the right words because we've never seen anything like this before. This was men against boys, but for once, Arsenal were the men. Let me break this down for you. From minute one, Arsenal's physical presence was overwhelming. You had Declan Rice and Thomas Partey in midfield, absolutely steamrolling anyone who came near them. Rice was everywhere, breaking up play, winning tackles, covering ground like a machine. The way he positioned himself to cut off passing lanes, you'd think he had a GPS tracker on the ball. And Partey? Man, he was playing like he had something to prove. The physicality he brought to the game was unreal. City's midfield couldn't handle it. Bernardo Silva, Mateo Kovacic, these technically gifted players were getting bounced around like pinballs. But it wasn't just the midfield. Look at Gabriel at the back. The way he handled Haaland. This is a striker who usually bullies defenders. But Gabriel was giving it right back to him. There's a moment where Haaland's on the ground and Gabriel's just letting him know who's boss. That's the kind of attitude we've been missing. The press was something else entirely. Arsenal were hunting in packs. Every time City got the ball, they had 2, 3 Arsenal players swarming them. You could see the panic in City's players' eyes. They couldn't handle the intensity. Even their goalkeeper was making mistakes under pressure. This is what's crazy. Historically, City have been the ones who physically dominate teams. They've been the ones who press high, who bully teams off the park. But today, they looked old. They looked slow. They couldn't match Arsenal's energy levels. And let's talk about Martinelli and Trossard on the wings. These guys were doing 70-yard sprints, tracking back, winning tackles, and then immediately sprinting forward to attack. The work rate was insane. City's fullbacks didn't know whether to stick or twist. You know what's beautiful about this? This wasn't just about talent or tactics. This was about hunger, about physicality, about showing City that the power dynamic has shifted. Arsenal didn't just want to play football. They wanted to impose themselves physically on every single duel. I've watched Arsenal for a while, and too often they've been the team that gets pushed around. But today they pushed back. Today they showed that they can be the bullies. And when you combine that physical dominance with the technical quality they have, that's when you get special performances like this. 5-1. 5-1 against the champions, against Pep Guardiola's Manchester City. And it wasn't a fluke. It was a physical demolition job. The kind of performance that changes perceptions. The kind of performance that sends a message to the whole league. This is the new Arsenal. No more rolling over. No more getting pushed around. Today wasn't just about winning. It was about dominating. And that's exactly what they did. Miles Lewis-Skelly and Ethan Nwaneri. Remember these names, because today they didn't just play against Manchester City. They absolutely dominated. Let's start with Lewis-Skelly. 18 years old, playing left back against the champions of England, and he's out there looking like he's been doing this for a decade. The composure this kid showed was unreal. You're playing against Manchester City, against players who've won everything, and you're treating it like it's a Sunday kickabout in the park. But it's not just about his technical ability, though that was exceptional. It's the mentality. Remember earlier this season when Haaland was asking, "Who are you?" to this kid? Well, today, Lewis-Skelly gave him his answer. Scores a beautiful goal, and what does he do? Does the Haaland celebration right in front of everyone. That's the kind of arrogance, the good kind of arrogance that Arsenal have been missing. And let's talk about that goal. Cuts inside, keeps his composure, finds the bottom corner. That's not a kid playing with fear. That's a player who knows exactly how good he is. The way he was bullying City's players, physically dominating them at 18 years old. It's frightening to think what he'll be like in a few years. Then there's Ethan Nwaneri, 17 years old. 17. Comes on when the game's already won, but instead of just seeing out the match, he decides to put on a show. That goal he scored, the way he shifted the ball, found that space, and then just guided it into the corner, that's pure natural talent. You can't teach that. What makes this even more special is the context. This wasn't some meaningless game. This was Manchester City. This was Pep Guardiola. This was a must-win match if Arsenal wanted to stay in the title race. And Arteta trusts these kids not just to play, but to express themselves. The technical ability of both players is off the charts. Lewis-Skelly's not just defending, he's inverting into midfield. He's creating chances. He's controlling the game. Nwaneri's got this glide about him, this ability to just drift past players like they're not even there. These aren't just good young players. These are potentially world-class talents. But what's really impressive is their physicality. Lewis-Skelly especially. He's out there winning physical battles against seasoned professionals. He's not just surviving, he's dominating. This is Premier League football, supposedly the most physical league in the world, and these teenagers are handling it like it's nothing. And let's talk about what this means for Arsenal's academy. Saka came through it, Smith Rowe came through it, and now you've got these two. That's not coincidence. That's excellent youth development. That's identifying talent, nurturing it, and then, most importantly, having the courage to give it a chance. The way both players handled the occasion speaks volumes about their mentality. No nerves, no hesitation, just pure confidence in their abilities. Lewis-Skelly's celebrating in Haaland's face. Nwaneri's out there doing tricks and flicks against the champions. This is what you want to see. This performance wasn't just about today. This was about Arsenal's future. When you've got academy graduates coming through who can perform like this against Manchester City, you know your club's doing something right. Hale End isn't just producing players anymore. It's producing stars. And here's the scary part. They're only going to get better. Lewis-Skelly's already looking like a complete midfielder playing at left back. Nwaneri's got this natural flair that you just can't coach. Give them a few more years of development, and who knows what level they could reach. This wasn't just academy products making up the numbers. This was academy products stealing the show on one of the biggest stages in English football. That's special. That's the kind of day that makes you proud to be associated with Arsenal Football Club. Also, you've got to understand the context here. For years, Manchester City have had Arsenal's number. They weren't just beating Arsenal, they were humiliating them. 5-0, 4-1, these kinds of scorelines were becoming routine. City would walk into these games with this aura of invincibility, and Arsenal would almost look beaten before the first whistle. But something changed last season. Arsenal started pushing back. The games got tighter, more intense. Then you had that match. Remember that? The stay humble incident. Haaland, after scoring that last-minute equalizer, goes up to Arsenal's players, goes up to Arteta, telling them to stay humble. The disrespect was clear as day. Then you've got all the build-up to this game. Arsenal fans painting Haaland's face on stop signs with crosses through them. The tension was building. You had Gabriel and Haaland's ongoing feud, which has become this fascinating subplot to these matches. Every time these two teams meet now, there's this extra edge. But here's what makes today so significant. Arsenal didn't just win, they dominated. And they did it with this swagger, this confidence that we haven't seen from them against City in years. When Lewis-Skelly scored and did Haaland's celebration, that wasn't just a goal celebration. That was a statement. That was Arsenal saying, we're not intimidated by you anymore. Look at the way Arsenal responded when City equalized. In the past, that might have been the moment where heads dropped, where the old doubts crept in. Instead, they raised their game to another level. They didn't just score again. They went on to put 5 past them. 5 goals against Pep Guardiola's Manchester City. Let that sink in. The psychological impact of this result can't be overstated. This wasn't just about 3 points. This was about Arsenal exercising their demons. This was about showing that the power dynamic has shifted. No more inferiority complex. No more mental blocks. Arsenal didn't just beat City. They bullied them off the park. And you could see it in City's players as the goals went in. The body language changed. The shoulders dropped. This wasn't the imperious City we're used to seeing. They looked vulnerable. They looked human. Arsenal exposed them in a way that teams have managed to in recent weeks. Think about what this does for Arsenal's confidence going forward. They've now proven to themselves that they can not only compete with City, but dominate them. That's huge for a young team. It creates this belief that they can beat anyone, anywhere. The Emirates was rocking today in a way we haven't seen for a big game in years. The fans sensed it. This wasn't just another win. This was a turning point. When you've got 60,000 people believing, when you've got young players like Lewis-Skelly and Nwaneri playing with such freedom and confidence against the champions, that tells you something has fundamentally changed. This result will echo through the rest of the season. Liverpool will have watched this and known they're in a real title race. City will have to go away and do some serious soul-searching. But for Arsenal, this was about more than just the title race. This was about making a statement, about showing they're no longer the team that gets pushed around by City. 5-1. That scoreline will be remembered for years. But more than the score, it's what it represents. Arsenal finally overcoming their City complex, finally showing they can not just compete with, but dominate one of the best teams of the modern era. That's not just a victory. That's a psychological breakthrough that could define this team's season. The old Arsenal might have crumbled under the pressure. The old Arsenal might have been intimidated by City's reputation. But this Arsenal stands tall. This Arsenal fights back. And today, this Arsenal showed everyone exactly why they shouldn't be staying humble anymore. Now let's talk about City, because this wasn't just a bad day at the office for Manchester City. This was a performance that exposed every single crack in this aging dynasty. What we saw today was the end of an era playing out in real time, and it was brutal to watch. Let's start with that midfield, because that's where City's problems begin and end. Remember when City's midfield used to suffocate teams? When Bernardo Silva, Kevin De Bruyne, and Rodri would pass teams to death, would press them into submission? Today, they looked like shadows. Bernardo Silva was getting bullied off the ball. Kovacic looked lost. There was no control, no rhythm, no physical presence. The most telling thing about this City team right now is how easy they are to play against. Arsenal's press absolutely destroyed them. Every time City tried to play out from the back, they looked terrified. John Stones, who used to be so composed, was giving the ball away like it was a hot potato. Akanji looked uncomfortable every time he was pressed. This is Manchester City we're talking about. The team that revolutionized playing out from the back in English football, and they couldn't string 3 passes together under pressure. But it's not just technical decline, it's physical. City's players looked like they were running in quicksand. When Arsenal turned up the intensity, City had no answer. Remember, when City used to be the team that could maintain that relentless pressure for 90 minutes? Today, they were the ones getting pressed into submission. The legs have gone. The intensity is gone. That fear factor that City used to have, it's completely evaporated. Let's talk about that defense because it was shocking today. 5 goals conceded, and it could have been more. The positioning was all wrong. The communication was non-existent. You've got Ortega in goal looking uncertain. You've got defenders making basic errors. This is a team that used to pride itself on its defensive organization. Today, they look like they'd never played together. The scariest part for City fans has to be how predictable they've become. Everyone knows what City want to do now, but unlike in previous seasons, they don't have the quality or the physicality to impose their game anyway. Teams aren't afraid anymore. Arsenal pressed high, attacked directly, and City had no plan B, no ability to mix it up, to fight back, to show some steel when things got tough. This decline hasn't happened overnight. We've seen signs of it all season. The defeat to Aston Villa, struggling against United, losing against PSG. But today was different. Today was a complete capitulation against one of their main rivals. 5-1 isn't just a defeat, it's a humiliation. And let's be honest about what's causing this. City have failed to rebuild at the right time. They've got no natural right back, playing Matheus Nunes there today, a midfielder who looked completely lost. The spine of this team, the players who made City great, they're past their peak. Pep Guardiola has to take some responsibility here. The decisions have been baffling at times. Playing Matheus Nunes at right back? Continuing to persist with a midfield that clearly lacks mobility? There's being stubborn and there's being negligent, and some of these decisions are starting to look like the latter. The most damning thing is this: the teams that used to fear City now smell blood. Arsenal didn't just beat City today, they bullied them. They knew City couldn't handle their press, couldn't match their intensity, couldn't cope with direct running. That's not something you would have said about City even 6 months ago. This isn't just a blip. This is what happens when you don't refresh a squad at the right time, when you stick too long with a system that opponents have figured out. What we saw today wasn't just Manchester City losing a game. It was the end of an era being confirmed in the most emphatic way possible. And for a team that's won 4 out of the last 5 Premier League titles, that's a pretty spectacular fall from grace. The question now isn't whether City can win the title. It's whether they can even finish in the top 4 playing like this. That's how far they've fallen. And based on today's evidence, this decline isn't stopping anytime soon. Moving on to the other side of Manchester. Look, I get it. When you've got Højlund and Xerxes not firing, when things aren't clicking up front, you want to try something different. But man, this false 9 experiment with Kabi Mainu, it just didn't work. Now, I'll give credit where it's due. For about 15 minutes at the start, it actually looked promising. Mainu was dropping deep, creating these little pockets of space. They were getting some nice movement with Garnacho and Ahmad playing off him. There was this one moment where he hit the post, and you're thinking, okay, maybe Amorim's onto something here. But here's the thing, and this is what kills me. Crystal Palace aren't stupid. They figured it out so quickly. Once they realized what United was doing, they just compressed the space, forced Mainu deeper and deeper, and suddenly they've got no presence in the box at all. You're watching crosses come in from Dalot, and there's just nobody there. Because Mainu, being naturally a midfielder, is dropping to the edge of the box, looking to link play instead of getting in there where a striker needs to be. And let's talk about possession, because this is what's really frustrating. United had, 67% possession. But what did they do with it? 2 shots on target. 2. They're passing it around, looking pretty in midfield, but there's no end product because they've got no focal point. When you play a false 9, you need runners beyond them. You need that movement. But their wingbacks weren't providing it, and Palace just sat there laughing at United trying to break them down. The really damning thing is when you look at what happened when Højlund and Xerxes came on. Yeah, they weren't great either. But at least there was someone in the box. At least there was someone occupying defenders. With Mainu as false 9, Palace's center backs had nothing to worry about. They could just step up, compress the space, and United are playing in front of them all day long. Listen, I appreciate Amorim trying something different. Sometimes you need to innovate. You need to find solutions. But you've got to know your personnel. Mainu's a brilliant young player, but he's not a false 9. He's never played there before. And when you're at home, against a team like Palace, who you know are going to sit deep and make it difficult, you need someone who's going to be in that box. Someone who's going to make things happen in the danger area. This experiment, it just highlights their bigger problems in attack. They're trying to find solutions, but sometimes the solution isn't about being clever or innovative. Sometimes it's just about getting the basics right. Get men in the box, create proper chances, and test the goalkeeper. Today, they did none of that, and that's why we're sitting here talking about another disappointing result at Old Trafford. I've got to be honest with you. Watching this game was like watching a horror film where you know the jump scare is coming, but you still can't look away. Let's start with those 2 goals because they perfectly sum up their defensive fragilities. That first one, and I've watched it back several times now, it's just schoolboy stuff. Yoro gets caught under the ball, which can happen, fine. But what kills me is Maguire's positioning. He's just standing there, absolutely static, while Mateta's already anticipating where that ball's going to drop. That's the difference between a striker's instinct and a defender who's just not reading the game. Basic defending 101, you've got to be expecting that ball to come back off the bar or the keeper. But no, United are caught flat-footed, and it's 1-0. Then the second goal. Oh my days. This is where it gets even more frustrating. They're pushing for an equalizer. I get that, but the way they got caught is just amateur hour. Maguire's playing this ridiculously high line, but he's not in sync with the rest of the defense. The timing of his step up is all wrong, and when Palace play that ball through, United are absolutely done for. You can't play offside trap when you're slower than a Sunday league player after 10 pints. It's just not going to work. But here's what really concerns me. These aren't just isolated incidents. All game long, we were looking shaky at the back. Palace had runners getting in behind us constantly. Think about that. We're playing with 5 at the back, and we're still getting carved open like a Christmas turkey. How is that even possible? The spacing between our defenders was all over the place. The communication seemed non-existent, and our positional awareness was shocking. And then, as if things couldn't get any worse, they lose Lisandro Martinez. Man, watching him go off on that stretcher in tears, that's heartbreaking. Not just because he's arguably their best defender, but because you can see how much it means to him. This guy is a warrior, and when you see him that emotional, you know it's serious. The impact this could have on their season cannot be understated. Martinez is the one defender they have who can actually play those progressive passes, who can break lines and start attacks. He's also the one guy who seems to actually organize that backline. What's really frightening is that this has become a pattern. They're not just making mistakes, they're making the same mistakes over and over again. The high line isn't working because they don't have the pace to recover. Their marking at set pieces is inconsistent at best. And most worrying of all, they seem to have this bizarre ability to make every opposing striker look like prime R9. The system Amorim wants to play requires intelligent defenders who can read the game, who can step up and drop back at the right moments, who can cover for each other. But what we saw today was the complete opposite. They've got defenders who seem to be playing their own individual games rather than working as a unit. You can have the best tactical setup in the world, but if your players can't execute the basics of defending, you're always going to be vulnerable. Looking ahead, with Martinez potentially out long term, they're in real trouble. The options they have aren't great. Do they trust Maguire to step up? These are questions Amorim's going to have to answer quickly because teams are going to look at this game and know exactly how to hurt them. The blueprint is there. Hit them on the counter, exploit the space behind their high line, and wait for the inevitable defensive brain fart. In the end, this wasn't just about 2 mistakes leading to goals. This was about fundamental defensive issues that have been plaguing them for years. And until they address these basic defensive principles, until they get defenders who can actually defend, they're going to keep seeing performances like this. It's as simple and as complicated as that. Now, let's talk about the technical side of United's performance today, because honestly, it was painful to watch. And I mean properly painful. The kind of performance that makes you question how some of these players are at Manchester United in the first place. Let's start with the basics. And I mean the absolute basics of football. We're talking about 5-yard passes here. The number of times today I watched players, professional footballers, mind you, miscue simple passes was staggering. Dalot was probably the biggest culprit. There was this one moment in the second half where he had acres of space, all the time in the world, and he still managed to pass it straight to a Palace player. It wasn't even like he was under pressure. He just couldn't execute a basic pass. But it wasn't just Dalot. The technical deficiencies were spread across the entire team. Ahmad, who's usually so good at receiving the ball on the half turn, his touch was heavy all game. Multiple times he had opportunities to turn and drive at the Palace defense, but his first touch let him down. It was like watching someone play with concrete boots on. The wingbacks, oh my days, the wingbacks. This is where it gets really frustrating because Amorim's system absolutely relies on them being technically proficient. They need to be able to control the ball, make quick decisions, put in accurate crosses. But what did we see today? Dalot and Mazraoui looking like they'd never played football before. The number of times they got into good positions, only to either miscontrol the ball or put in a cross that didn't beat the first man. It was maddening. And here's the thing that really kills me. This isn't just a one-off bad day at the office. These technical deficiencies have been evident for weeks, months even. But today it was particularly glaring because of how Palace set up. They sat back, They gave United the ball. They said, go on then, break us down. And they couldn't. Not because they didn't have the tactical plan, but because they literally couldn't execute the basic technical skills required to implement that plan. Let's talk about Garnacho for a minute. Young player, lots of potential, but today he was getting absolutely schooled by Richards. And it wasn't just because Richards is a good defender. It was because Garnacho's technical execution was so poor. His touches were heavy, his dribbling was predictable, and when he did get past his man, his final ball was awful. This is a 60 million pound player we're talking about, and he couldn't even get the basics right. The midfield wasn't much better. Ugarte, who's usually quite reliable in possession, was giving the ball away cheaply. Bruno Fernandes, our captain, was trying these elaborate passes when simple ones would do and getting them wrong. It's like there's this collective inability to just do the simple things well. And this is where we need to have a serious conversation about recruitment and coaching. Because yes, Amorim's system is demanding. It requires players to be technically excellent, to be able to play in tight spaces, to execute quick combinations. But if your players can't even complete a 5-yard pass consistently, how can you expect them to play this kind of football? What makes it even more frustrating is that we're seeing this at Old Trafford. This is supposed to be their home, where they dominate teams, where they play with confidence. Instead, we're watching professional footballers struggle with the absolute basics of the game. Palace weren't even pressing them aggressively. They didn't need to. They just sat back and watched United give the ball away. The really worrying thing is that this isn't something you can fix quickly. Technical ability at this level, or lack thereof, is something that's developed over years. These are ingrained habits, ingrained deficiencies. And when you're trying to play a progressive, possession-based style of football, these technical limitations become glaringly obvious. Look at how City play, how Arsenal play. Every player in their team is technically proficient. They can all control a ball, make a pass, execute the basics consistently. Until United get to that level, and it's going to take a lot of coaching and probably a lot of recruitment, they're going to keep seeing performances like this. We can talk about tactics and systems all day long, but if you can't execute the basic technical aspects of football, none of that matters. What we're seeing here is the culmination of years, actually over a decade, of systemic problems at Manchester United. And today's performance against Crystal Palace just crystallized every single one of them. Let's start with the mentality issue, because it's absolutely glaring. When Palace scored that first goal, you could literally see the belief drain from the players. It's become this horrible, self-fulfilling prophecy at Old Trafford. They go behind. The players start second-guessing themselves. The crowd gets nervous, and suddenly they're playing with this overwhelming sense of anxiety. It's like watching a psychological drama unfold in real time. And speaking of Old Trafford, let's talk about what's happened to their home ground. The theater of dreams? More like the theater of delights for visiting teams right now. Do you remember when teams used to come to Old Trafford and basically be beaten before they got off the bus? That fear factor, that aura, it's completely gone. Look at the stats. Brighton, Bournemouth, Forest, now Palace. They're all coming here and playing like it's their backyard. 2 wins in their last 7 home games in the Premier League. That's not just bad. That's historically awful for Manchester United. But here's what really kills me about this whole situation. They've got this bizarre Jekyll and Hyde personality as a club. They can go to Arsenal and get a result. They can put in a decent performance against Liverpool, but put them up against a team that sits deep and counters, and they look absolutely clueless. It's like they've completely forgotten how to break down organized defenses. Palace today didn't do anything revolutionary. They just sat in their shape, stayed disciplined, and waited for United to make mistakes. And boy, did they make mistakes. The really concerning thing is that this isn't just about the current squad or the current manager. We're seeing the same patterns repeat themselves regardless of who's in charge. Ten Hag saw it, Rangnick saw it, Ole saw it, Mourinho saw it. They've had different managers with different philosophies all running into the same fundamental issues. At some point, you've got to look beyond the tactical board and ask some serious questions about the club's structure. Look at their recruitment over the years. They've spent, what, close to £1 billion since Fergie left. And what do they have to show for it? A squad full of players who either aren't good enough technically, aren't strong enough mentally, or both. They've got players on massive wages who they can't shift, young players who they're putting too much pressure on too soon, and a complete lack of coherent planning in terms of how they want to play. The financial aspect of this is crucial too, because it's creating this vicious cycle. They overpay for players because they're Manchester United. Then they can't sell them because no one else can match their wages. So they're stuck with them even when it's clear they're not working out. Meanwhile, their rivals are building squads with clear philosophies, clear progression plans, and most importantly, clear identities. This brings me to the youth development and progression pathways at the club. We're seeing young players like Mainu, Garnacho, and Ahmad being thrown into situations they're probably not ready for, simply because their senior players aren't performing. Don't get me wrong, these kids have talent, but they're asking them to fix problems that have been festering for years. And then there's the pressure cooker environment they've created. Every defeat is a crisis. Every poor performance leads to calls for someone's head, whether it's the manager, the players, or the board. They've lost the ability to build anything sustainable because they're constantly lurching from one quick fix solution to another. The saddest part? This was all predictable. When Sir Alex left, they didn't just lose a manager. They lost the glue that was holding together a system that was already starting to show cracks. He was papering over institutional problems with his sheer force of personality and managerial genius. Once he left, those cracks became chasms, and they're still falling into them a decade later. What we saw today against Palace wasn't just a tactical failure or a case of players having an off day. It was a perfect storm of every systemic issue that's been building at this club, from the boardroom to the boot room. Until they address these fundamental problems, until they actually rebuild the foundations rather than just redecorating the house, they're going to keep seeing days like this. And that's what makes it so painful for United fans. It's not just about losing to Crystal Palace. It's about knowing that this same script is going to keep playing out until someone has the courage and the capability to implement real structural change at the club. The question is, who's going to do it? And how long will it take? All right, guys, let's talk about this Barcelona win against Alaves. And I've got to be honest with you, this was not pretty football. This was one of those games where you just have to get through it and take the 3 points. I mean, for the first 45 minutes especially, it felt like watching paint dry. Barcelona were just so sluggish, so slow in their build-up, and the atmosphere at the Montjuic wasn't helping either. It was dead quiet at times. You know what's crazy though? I was more nervous about this game for Barcelona than I would be for a match against Real Madrid or Atletico. Why? Because these are the games that have been killing them this season. These low block teams that just sit back, defend with everyone behind the ball, and make it impossible to play through them. And Alaves did exactly that today. The first half was just painful to watch. Barcelona couldn't create anything meaningful. The ball was moving so slowly from side to side. There was no penetration, no real threat. I think they had, maybe 2 decent chances in that entire first half. That's just not good enough for a team like Barcelona. But here's the thing, and this is what makes this win so massive. Real Madrid lost yesterday to Espanyol. They actually lost. And suddenly, this boring, difficult game became an absolutely crucial opportunity. Barcelona had to capitalize on that slip-up, and despite how ugly it was, they did exactly that. Let's put this in perspective. They were 7 points behind Madrid, which felt like a mountain to climb. Now, it's just 4 points. 4. And guess what? Real Madrid and Atletico play each other next weekend, which means at least one of them, maybe both, will drop points. The title race is wide open again. That's why sometimes in football, you have to forget about the beautiful game and just get the job done. Sure, they want to see tiki-taka. They want to see flowing football. They want to see multiple goals. But in a title race, these scrappy 1-0 wins can be worth their weight in gold. Look at the bigger picture. They've closed the gap, they've kept a clean sheet, and they've shown they can win even when they're not playing well. That's what championship teams do. It wasn't Barcelona at their best, far from it, but it was Barcelona showing character, showing persistence, and most importantly, showing they can take advantage when their rivals slip up. And let's be real, these are the kinds of wins that can define a season. It's easy to get hyped up and perform in the big games, but grinding out results against teams that park the bus on a Sunday afternoon when nothing seems to be working, that's what separates champions from contenders. So yeah, it wasn't pretty. It wasn't the kind of game you'll want to watch again. But when we look back at this season, this sluggish, difficult 1-0 win might just be one of the most important results of the campaign for Barcelona. Sometimes you've got to win ugly to win big, and today that's exactly what Barcelona did. Now, let's talk about Lamine Yamal today, because what we witnessed was absolutely incredible. I mean, we're getting used to seeing special things from this kid, and I almost don't want to call him a kid anymore because he's playing like a seasoned veteran. But today was something else entirely. Let's start with that moment in the first half, because it's going to be replayed over and over again. Picture this. Yamal picks up the ball, and what happens next is pure magic. One player comes at him. He glides past. Second defender, same result. Third, fourth, fifth. He's just weaving through them like they're training cones. By the time he's done, he's beaten 7 players. 7! It gave me flashbacks to Messi, and I don't say that lightly. The way he just kept the ball glued to his feet, the close control, the balance, it was absolutely outrageous. And here's what's crazy. He's doing this at 17 years old to grown men with families. Some of these defenders probably have kids closer to Yamal's age than their own, and he's out here embarrassing them on national television. The ease with which he goes past players is just not normal. But what really impresses me about Yamal is his football intelligence. It's one thing to have skills, to be able to dribble past players. It's another thing entirely to know when to use those skills, when to release the ball, when to shoot. Look at how he was involved in the goal. He gets the ball in a tight space, knows exactly what he wants to do with it. And while it takes a deflection, his awareness to even get into that position and create something is remarkable. What makes him even more special is his physical profile. When you look at some of the greatest dribblers we've seen, Messi, Neymar, Hazard, they're usually shorter players with a low center of gravity. Yamal is different. He's tall, 5'9", but he has this incredible balance and control that you just don't see in players his size. The way he can protect the ball, turn on a dime, and accelerate past defenders, it's a unique combination of physical attributes and technical skills. Every time he touched the ball today, something happened. There was always a sense of possibility, of potential danger for Alaves. In a game where Barcelona were struggling to create chances, where the attack looked stagnant at times, Yamal was the constant spark. He wasn't just trying tricks for the sake of it. Everything he did had a purpose, was aimed at breaking down that stubborn Alaves defense. We need to talk about his confidence too. To play like this, at his age, in a game where Barcelona desperately needed 3 points, that takes serious mental strength. He's not playing it safe. He's not hiding from responsibility. He's demanding the ball, taking on players, trying to make things happen. That's the mark of a special player. You know what's actually scary? He's only going to get better. This isn't even his final form. He's still developing, still learning, still growing into his body. The fact that Barcelona are working on a new contract for him shows how much they value him, and today proved exactly why. In a few years, we might look back at these performances as just the beginning of something truly extraordinary. But let's also be careful with the comparisons. Yes, he reminded us of Messi today with some of those dribbles. But Yamal is his own player, with his own unique style, and he deserves to forge his own path. What we saw today wasn't just a young player showing potential. It was a genuine match winner, making a difference when his team needed him most. And at 17 years old, that's nothing short of remarkable. You know, it's funny. Sometimes the most important tactical decisions aren't the flashy ones. They're these subtle changes that just make everything click into place. Let's start with that first change, bringing Eric Garcia on for Araujo. Now look, I love Araujo. He's probably one of the best pure defenders in world football right now. But in games like this, against teams that sit deep and force you to build from the back, his limitations with the ball become really apparent. What we saw in that first half was Barcelona struggling to progress the ball effectively. Araujo was on a yellow card too, which wasn't helping matters. But the bigger issue was their build-up play was just too slow, too predictable. Enter Eric Garcia, and suddenly everything starts flowing better. It's fascinating to watch because Eric isn't doing anything particularly spectacular. He's just more comfortable on the ball, more willing to step into midfield, more capable of playing those line-breaking passes. What this did was give Barcelona an extra dimension in possession. Instead of just recycling the ball from side to side, Eric was able to find these pockets of space, these angles that weren't there before. But the real masterclass from Flick was that double change, bringing on Frenkie de Jong for Casado. Now, Casado didn't have a bad game per se, but he was kind of stuck in this position where he couldn't really influence the game the way they needed. Alaves had this really smart pressing scheme where they were using their forwards to cut off the passing lanes to Barcelona's midfield, and Casado just couldn't find the spaces to operate. Frenkie de Jong, though? That's a completely different story. The moment he came on, the whole dynamic of the midfield changed. De Jong has this unique ability to receive the ball under pressure and turn into space. He's not just passing the ball, he's carrying it. He's driving forward. He's breaking lines with his movement. There was this one moment where he picked up the ball deep, drove past two players, and suddenly Alaves' whole defensive structure had to shift. What was really clever about these substitutions was how they complemented each other. Eric Garcia's ability to step into midfield meant De Jong could push higher up. And then you've got Pedri finding these little pockets of space between the lines. It created this domino effect where Alaves couldn't just sit in their low block anymore. They had to start coming out to press. And that's when the spaces started appearing. And let's talk about timing here, because that's crucial too. Flick didn't wait until they were desperate. He made these changes early enough in the second half to give them time to impact the game. That shows a manager who's reading the game well, who understands what his team needs. It's not just about having good players on the bench. It's about knowing when to use them and how to use them effectively. The goal might have come from a bit of individual brilliance and some fortunate deflections, but it was these substitutions that laid the groundwork. They changed the entire complexion of the game, gave Barcelona more control, more fluidity, more options in attack. Before these changes, they were kind of just hoping something would happen. After them, they were making things happen. This is what good coaching looks like: identifying the problem, having the courage to make changes, even when they might seem a bit counterintuitive, like taking off a defender as solid as Araujo, and then seeing those changes pay off. It's easy to criticize managers when things go wrong, so we should also give credit when they get it right. Today, Flick read the game perfectly, and his substitutions were absolutely crucial in securing those 3 points. And you know what? This kind of tactical flexibility, this ability to change the game from the bench, that's what you need if you're going to challenge for titles. It's not always going to be your starting 11 that wins you games. Sometimes it's these in-game adjustments, these tactical tweaks that make the difference between 1 point and 3. Today was a perfect example of that. Okay, let's talk about Barcelona's performance today, because I think it's something that's not getting enough attention. Yeah, I know, we're all caught up in how difficult it was to break down Alaves, how the attack wasn't flowing, but sometimes you've got to appreciate a solid defensive display. First, let's put this in context. When your attack isn't clicking, when you're struggling to create chances, that's usually when you're most vulnerable. Teams start pushing forward, gaps appear, and suddenly you're exposed. But today, Barcelona's defense was absolutely rock solid, and we've got to give credit where it's due. Koundé, in particular, was immense. You know what really impressed me about their defensive setup today? The organization. Even when players were getting substituted, even when they had to deal with that early setback of Gavi going off with that concerning head injury, the defensive structure never wavered. Alaves, and let's be honest, they're fighting for their lives down there in the relegation zone. They barely created anything meaningful. I mean, when you look at the stats, it's actually ridiculous. 0 shots on target. 0. Let's talk about Koundé specifically because he was absolutely crucial today, especially in those nervy final minutes. There was this one moment, I think it was around the 85th minute, where Alaves finally managed to string together a decent counterattack, and Koundé just comes out of nowhere with this perfectly timed tackle. That's the kind of intervention that wins you games, that turns 1 point into 3. But it wasn't just about last-ditch defending. What really stood out to me was how well Barcelona managed the high line today. You saw Alaves trying to play those balls over the top. They had, 11 offsides? That's not just luck. That's a defensive line that's perfectly synchronized. They're stepping up at exactly the right moments, catching attackers off guard and completely nullifying any threat Alaves tried to create. And let's give some credit to Szczęsny here too. Yeah, he didn't have many saves to make, but his positioning was spot on throughout. There were a couple of crosses that could have been dangerous, but he was always in the right place at the right time. That kind of commanding presence in your box, it gives confidence to the entire defensive unit. One thing that really caught my eye was how well Barcelona defended transitions today. You know those moments when you lose the ball and you're potentially exposed? The reaction time to get back into shape was incredible. The midfield was dropping in to cover spaces. The fullbacks were tucking in when needed. It was like watching a well-oiled machine. What makes this defensive performance even more impressive is that they had to make those changes. When Eric Garcia came on for Araujo, you might have thought they'd lose some defensive stability. But no, the team adapted perfectly. Eric actually helped them defend better in a different way, by allowing them to keep possession better, and thus preventing Alaves from even getting the ball in dangerous areas. This is the kind of defensive display that championship teams put in. Everyone remembers the great attacking performances, the 4-0 wins, the beautiful goals. But these 1-0 victories, where your defense stands firm while your attack figures things out, these are just as important. This is what builds the foundation for a title challenge. And here's something else to consider. This clean sheet isn't just about today's game. It builds confidence. It shows that even when they're not at their flowing best going forward, they can still control games, they can still keep things tight at the back. That's a valuable lesson to take forward as they head into the business end of the season. So, yeah, maybe it wasn't the most exciting game to watch. Maybe we'd all love to see Barcelona scoring 3 or 4 goals every match. But sometimes you've got to appreciate the art of defending. And today, that defensive unit put on a masterclass. Clean sheet, 0 shots on target allowed, perfect positional play. That's something to be proud of. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate you. I never thought I would actually be able to have an audience to listen to me, but here we are. Thank you for tuning in and listening. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. This has been Across the Pitch, over and out.